for your generous introduction. Thank you to Temenos for inviting me to speak. Thank you for waiting for me. I had wanted to do this last year, but I couldn't. So I'm especially grateful, Hilary, for your patience. And thank you to Daniel for sorting everything out today. I'm going to be talking about a group of paintings that this man, Peter LANYON, not working, there we go, sorry, made between 1960 and the late summer of 1964, when he completely unexpectedly died. They're known as his gliding paintings because they were informed by his experience of flying gliders, an activity that he took up in the autumn of 1959 and continued with right up until his death in 64. Indeed, as you may know, if you have not already guessed, he died as a result of injuries sustained in a gliding accident. There are about 20 of these paintings, as far as we know, and I'll show you some of them this evening, mainly from 1960. I'll talk about how they relate to gliding, and then I will ask the fundamental question as to why did he make them? And in talking about that, I hope to draw out a continuity that runs through his mature oeuvre of a philosophical idea. Before I do any of that, though, I think I should tell you a little, it's a potted history of Peter LANYON and why he's considered to be of significance in the history of art in this country in the 20th century. He was born in St. Ives in 1918, and St. Ives at that time was a thriving community of artists, or artist colony, and he was born right into the middle of that. His parents were well-known figures in that world. He grew up in it. Indeed, he was to live almost his entire life in St. Ives, bar the period of the war when he served in the armed forces. No surprise, therefore, that he wanted to be an artist, or that his parents completely supported him in that intention. His reputation really stands, I think, on the works that he did after the war, working within the landscape genre. I think it is probably widely acknowledged that he was one of the people who modernized that genre, using some of the new pictorial languages available to artists in the 20th century and extended what the landscape genre might be able to address. To put it in a really simple way, I think he took the landscape genre from being one which primarily involved looking at the landscape to being in the landscape. And we'll see how he did that, or attempted to do that, in his paintings this evening. But before we get on to the paintings, I want to talk to you about gliding, because I am rather assuming that most of you have been in powered aircraft, but have not been in gliders. And I hope I'm correct in making that assumption. I learned to fly because I thought it would be important to follow my quarry into the sky and see what he had experienced up there and how that had informed these paintings. And I'm very glad I did, because the experience of flying a glider is fundamentally different to flying in a powered aircraft, and also one's experience of the air is really, really different. So to state the blindingly and rather alarmingly obvious difference between a glider and a normal airplane is, of course, that a glider doesn't have an engine. And that means that the method of flying and the experience of the air is quite different. What I think one discovers when you're flying in a glider, as opposed to a powered aircraft, is that the airplane is entirely dependent on the forces in the sky. whereas a powered airplane is simply subject to them. A powered aircraft, as we all know, flies thanks to a combination of its highly aerodynamic design and the thrust of its engines, which allow it to move through the air at a speed that allows it to fly. And it can fly pretty much through all air conditions to get from its starting point A to its destination B, more or less on time. And a marvelous and world-transforming means of transport it has proved to be. A glider, of course, because it doesn't have an engine, can't do much of that. And it means that a glider is a hopeless form of transport. It starts at A, and almost all flights end at A. And a lot of them only last a few minutes because there's simply not enough going on in the sky to support the aircraft. That is a negative consequence of not having an engine. The positive one, from my experience anyway, is that as a pilot of a glider, because you have to attend so much to the immediate air conditions around the aircraft, you have to have a much closer relationship with the active forces in the sky than you would ever need to do as a pilot of a powered aircraft. Effectively, what you find yourself doing is you're hunting out the air conditions which will lift the plane. And when you find them, you explore them and you exploit them. Those forces, which we obviously can all see looking at the sky, there's an awful lot going on in it. But actually to be in those forces is something quite different. The sorts of things that you're looking for are, sorry, this is a glider, by the way, I hope you can. The sorts of forces you're looking for are, well, first of all, one of the most common is a thermal. And a thermal is an enormous bubble of rising air coming from the ground, carrying moisture up to the cloud level. If you can find one of those, and you'll certainly know when you have, the aim of the pilot is to edge the aircraft further and further inside that thermal until, in fact, the whole plane is within it. Once you're there, you are on an elevator. And that thermal can be rising typically at 800 feet a minute, but in a strong one, you could be rising at 2,000 feet a minute, which, just to give you some context, that's as fast as a commercial airliner ascends from takeoff to its cruising altitude. This is an astonishing force, which is occurring all over the surface of the Earth every day. Thermals top out normally at about 14,000 feet, but they can stop much lower than that. There's another force in the sky called wave lift, which can take a glider to truly astonishing altitudes. It occurs over mountains, and the world record, altitude record for a glider, is an amazing, literally breathtaking 75,000 feet, which is more than double the height at which a commercial airliner flies. Where there's also falling air, and it's called sink by glider pilots, and it's basically large blocks of cold air falling through the sky. If you encounter that when you're in a plane, in a glider, it's as if the air has lost its buoyancy and you drop. What in fact is happening is the air is just pushing you down, like an enormous hand pushing you down. Quite useful if you want to lose altitude, but on the whole you don't, so you'd fly out of that. It occurs often under quite large clouds as well. Clouds are places you don't want to fly into. They are pretty dangerous, not just because of the limited visibility, but because the forces inside large clouds are extremely violent and quite capable of ripping a glider apart. For that reason, few people fly into large clouds, though some have. For the most part, you fly in the lower air between the ground and the clouds. And within that zone, you fly at a minimum velocity of 40 knots, but you can easily go up to 150 knots, which is the advised upper limit. With that, you can perform all sorts of aerobatic feats if you want to. But more astonishingly, I think, is that you can fly for hours, covering hundreds of miles, without any onboard source of energy whatsoever. Of course, a normal aircraft would expend a huge amount of fuel to cover the same amount of territory. But in a glider, you do this simply by using the forces which are in the sky. It has been said, I think rather misleadingly, let's go up. Here we go. These are my photographs from being in a glider, by the way. This is a very typical view. And underneath all of those clouds are thermals. So you can see where the thermals ought to be, and you'd fly towards them, not necessarily always strong enough to support you. Now, it has been said, somewhat misleadingly, I'd say, that flying a glider is like being a soaring bird. Well, the truth is, when those creatures fly near you, it is much more like a lesson in humility, because they are so beautifully evolved. They can exploit with maximum efficiency even the tiniest variations in the air. Whereas a pilot of the glider is actually blundering through the same air conditions, only feeling the stronger currents, and all the time checking your instruments to make sure you've got enough altitude, seeing what your rate of climb or fall is, how fast you're going, scanning the ground beneath you to work out where on earth you are, and where your airfield that you set off from might be and how you could get back there, and whether you've even got enough altitude to do so. And if you haven't, and you can't see anywhere where you're likely to get any rising air, where on earth are you going to land, ideally safely? That is all that's going on in one's mind. And of course, that does all sound like the most terrifying multitask. But in truth, it quickly becomes a really absorbing activity, one which requires a lot of mental and sensory concentration. Mental, because clearly there's a lot of calculation, but sensory, well, sight is obvious, hearing, because some of the instruments are sonic, but most surprisingly of all, touch. Touch, because the aircraft is really your body, and its wings are like your arms outstretched. Its wing tips are like your hands and your fingers, feeling the air for the palpable forces in the sky, which you are seeking to exploit. To give you an idea of that, Lanyon said that when the wingtip of a plane first touches the edge of a thermal, it's like encountering a barking dog. That's really, really well put. It's exactly like that. It is sudden, it is violent, and it is definitely there, and you feel it in the aircraft. For the really experienced pilots, this sort of attention to the air can verge on a spiritual connection with one of nature's primary forces. There was a champion glider pilot called Philip Wills who wrote a number of books about gliding at this time that Lanyon was flying. And in one of them, he says this: the air to a glider pilot is a reality, not a shadow on a screen. He is in direct relationship with it. He is trying to understand it in all its moods, to learn its flow, its laws, and its colors, and to try and use this knowledge to his own ends. And then he continues, a glider pilot never need feel alone, for the air embraces us all, and within its womb, we are all brothers. I hope that gives you some sense of what this extraordinary activity is like. It's incredibly memorable once you've done it, and the memory of it is not visual, it's actually bodily. When I started gliding, I had the most extraordinary experience of being able to look up at the clouds and not see them, to actually really feel the tremor underneath the clouds. It's extraordinary. Let's go on to Peter Lanyon. So he starts flying on the 5th of October 1959 from this place, which is Perranporth Airfield on the northwest coast of Cornwall. And as you can see, it's a rather spectacular airfield. This is his photograph, actually, from a glider of it. And there's one runway there, which you can see runs almost to the cliff face. That's 200 feet, that cliff. So pretty exciting place to land in and take off from. Lanyon had been in aircraft before he started flying gliders, albeit as a passenger. And he understood the principles of flight because he had served in the RAF as a mechanic. But even he, with his knowledge, such as it was before he went into a glider, was completely astonished by what he discovered when he went up for the first time in 1959. He later wrote that I have discovered since I began gliding, the activity is more sensual than I guessed. The air is a very definite world of activity, as complex and demanding as the sea. Now, let's get into him. Here he is. First day, I think, or thereabouts. He's in the baseball hat. So the first months of his training were conducted in a two-seater glider with dual controls and an instructor. In June, he flew, this is June 1960, he flew his first solo flight. A solo flight is a landmark event in any trainee pilot's education. What it involves is, because up to this point, you have always flown with an instructor, but for the solo flight, as the term suggests, you fly a flight on your own. And it's a very short flight. You do a takeoff, you do a circuit of the airfield, and you land. It's by no means the point at which you're capable of flying on your own fully, but it is a very important moment in terms of building your confidence about your ability to do the two really crucial things, which are to take off and to land. Landing safely, obviously, is rather important, not something that Lanyon, sadly, completely mastered. The development of Lanyon after that, in terms of his gliding capabilities, are not that well known. But we do know that by March 1961, he was competent enough to fly solo all the time. Thereafter, his logbooks have been lost, but we do catch glimpses of him in gliding magazines. So, for example, we hear in November 1961 that he'd flown a 5-hour leg in a thermal, by which I think he means just went from thermal to thermal over 5 hours. And then in August 1963, he flew a long cross-country flight, a term used by gliders to refer to a competitive structured circuit, whereby a very large circuit, many, many miles, the pilot has to fly over designated landmarks, and whoever does it best and quickest wins the race, so to speak. Lanyon loved all of this, and he clearly enjoyed the sport of it. But much more importantly for us is that he found a subject for painting within gliding. So finally, we get to the paintings. Well, that's him, by the way. He's looking rather good in his glider, red glider. Worth noting the color, perhaps. So this is the first painting he makes to do directly with gliding. It's called Rose Wall, and he finished it in January of 1960. Rose Wall is a place, it's a hill west of St. Ives, about a mile west of St. Ives. And in his notes for this painting, and Lanyon made short notes about many of these paintings, as he did lots of his paintings, in fact, he reveals that the painting refers to the pilot's bodily and visual experience as he spirals in a thermal over the hilltop at Rose Wall. And I think we get a sense of that in the sort of the vortex towards the top of the painting, with its smears of pinks, whites, and greens, and also those centrifugally flung threads of paint that come off it. I think, as following Lanyon's lead, one should read this really as an index of the flight path and a representation of the blur of the land and sky as they slide around the cockpit. A few months later, and these paintings took Lanyon months to make. He's not the type of painter who can work on a picture in a day and it's finished. He works and works and works on his pictures. A few months later, he completed this painting, which visualizes one of the really colossal invisible forces in the air, namely a thermal. And it's called thermal, this painting. And the thermal rises on the left, gathering form. And as you can see right at the top, you can almost see that there's a fully formed bubble. And I think one should read that as the mature thermal. And it culminates seemingly at the top and then dies away on the right side before starting all again up the left side. Quite often in these gliding paintings, you see this sort of cycle or circular motion. In June, he painted Solo Flight, this painting, which he made just as he was preparing to fly on his own for the first time. And the rather labored, heavy, and slightly frenzied in places red line seems to demarcate the circuit round the airfield that comprises any pilot's first solo flight. He said of it that he had wanted to create a sense of solitary quietness and a sharp awareness of the ground below. Well, I think the solitary quietness may be read into that red line, which sits on top of everything that is beneath it, is not meshed into it in any way, not involved really with the ground beneath it. And that ground is extremely heavily textured, and uniquely amongst the gliding paintings, this painting is on board. All the others are on canvas. And I think Lanyon chose board because he was able to build up many layers of paint and then dig into them to create this textured effect. A sharp awareness of the ground, of course, is also something you very much have when you're flying your first solo flight, as it is the site of security and also of potential catastrophe. At the same time as he made this picture, he painted Cross Country, a much more dramatic painting in which I think the underlying blocks of blue, white, and green probably refer to the sky and land and sea. Well, certainly we can think of them in that way. And the sweeping black strokes may refer to the glider's flight path as the aircraft banks and turns, sinks and soars in the attempt to stay the cross-country course. By mid-August, he had finished this painting titled Soaring Flight, which was the title of the show at the Courtauld. Lanyon wrote a little bit about this painting, and I think it's quite instructive to hear what he has to say. He said of it that it is this is him, a description of the sensation of soaring, a slow climbing movement and a fast downwind return, familiar to anyone who has watched birds in flight. And then he explains what he means. The red rises up the left side to set the whole motion. One almost stays still in the inverted V, but then sweeps down to the bottom right corner and back through the brown squiggle up the red again. And then he continues. The movement goes at different speeds. So does the eye as it moves across and into the picture. The horizontal line of the ground forms the static element against which the dynamic forces can play. Well, that description, I think, takes us to the heart of why Lanyon painted gliding in this way. He could have used a much more established and much more widely understood pictorial language had he wanted to. He could have painted it like this. This is a painting by William Nicholson, the brilliant English artist, a couple of generations older than Lanyon. And it is of gliders at Dunstable, and it's painted in 1933. In fact, that's where I learned to fly. And what you see in the picture at the bottom is we're on the edge of the ridge, looking down onto the airfield. And on the left-hand side on the airfield, that white line is in fact a glider with some people dotted around it. And in the sky are two gliders flying, and then this long recession into the far distance. We're all very, very familiar with this way of depicting pictorial space in landscape. This stacking of foreground, midground, distance. And Lanyon was very capable of painting in that way. And indeed, in between 1934 and 1939, he'd used exactly that system to paint over 150 pictures. At one time, perhaps less now, critics wrote of this system as traditional, which it is. It is a tradition that has gone a long way back into the European history of painting, but also as conventional, and often used that in a rather pejorative way, in contrast to the type of painting, or the type of pictorial language that Lanyon and many artists in the middle of the 20th century were using, which they termed modern, contemporary, even avant-garde. I don't think Peter Lanyon really thought of it in that way. He thought that these are two different pictorial languages, each with their own powers and limitations. And for him, the question was, which one would serve his purposes best? As a young man, he had wanted to depict the physical appearance of the landscape around his home in St. Ives. And he had, like lots of the pre-war artists in St. Ives, gone out into the landscape with his painting box, set up his board, and got his colors ready and set to, in the full plein air method, to capture the changing effects of light and the forms of the landscape before him. This is a painting of a place called Carngalva, which is a little bit further west from Rosewall. And what you can see is some cottages in the foreground there, and then Carngalva in the far distance, and then beyond that, the sea. And of course, a rather stormy Cornish sky. In those days, Lanyon used perspective because it is an essential component of these types of paintings, because it gives such a convincing illusion of a unified three-dimensional space. And if you want to paint a view, then it is a perfectly evolved system for doing that. And that's exactly what Peter Lanyon wanted to do when he painted this picture in about 1938. He wanted the view of this place from this position on that stormy day. During the war, his aims for his paintings changed because he changed. He served as a mechanic in the RAF from 1940 to 46, posted for 2 years in England, and the rest in Egypt, Palestine, and Italy. For the first time in his life, he was away from St. Ives, a place that he now realized was a very unusual place, quite unlike the British Armed Forces, a place where art was just, in St. Ives, a normal part of life, far from the case when he was serving in the war. He was also away from his class. Peter Lanyon was not an officer, he was an ordinary serviceman. And he came from an upper middle class, wealthy family, money derived from mining on both sides. And he was away from Britain. And so he found himself living with people and in countries which were quite different to those that he had known before. And finally, he was away from peace. And though not involved in the fighting, he was near it at times and certainly not cocooned from its effects or consequences. And so it is no great surprise that he changed. The war changed millions of people. He had been interested in politics before the war. He had considered joining the Republican cause in Spain in 1938. But it was really his experience of being in the RAF that convinced him a new alignment was urgently needed in Britain, in Europe, and I suppose ultimately across the world. But Lanyon's program for that settlement wasn't simply economic, social, or political, because he did not consider the causes of the war to have been just economic, social, or political. For him, not to say that he was not aware that those were significant factors, but for him, in addition, the war was a consequence of a misalignment of man's relationship with the natural environment. For him, the primary cause of that misalignment was a dominant system of thought within European civilization that promoted what he called static concepts. That is to say, concepts that promote form and matter over process and becoming in nature, that promoted permanence instead of change. He believed that that system of thought put man at odds with the reality of the highly dynamic natural process of which we are all inextricably, indivisibly a part. He didn't come up with this idea. He had begun to think about this at the beginning of the war, when he met a remarkable group of artists, Naum Gabo, the Russian constructivist, Barbara Hepworth, and Ben Nicholson. Not to say that they necessarily shared his line of thinking, but they certainly gave him the confidence to think that art might be more than the depiction of the appearances of the world, and it might serve a true social purpose. We don't know exactly what he read at this time. We don't know if he read Goethe's Study of Morphology. We don't know if he read Bergson's Poetic Philosophy of Becoming. But we do know that he read the books of a now obscure person called Lancelot Law White. And White, in his writings, did refer to such people as, or such writings as those of Goethe and Bergson. And White, in his book, The Next Development of Man, which Lanyon read during the war, and which he referred to as his Bible after the war, and which he quoted from. In this book, White discussed the ongoing crisis in European civilization as a consequence of this disconnection between man and his environment. So when White wrote this book, he wrote it in 1943, it's published in 1944. He asks the very pertinent question that quite a lot of books like this at that time asked, which is, how on earth had things come to this terrible present? And the second question was, how can we make the future better than this? White's answer to the first question was similar to what I've just said about Lanyon's thinking, but Lanyon's thinking derives from White. His answer was that European civilization had lost sight of man's true relationship with his environment, and in so doing had set man apart from the intrinsic dynamism of our environment and had built thereby a false expectation of permanence where there is none, of stasis where there is only dynamism. White argued that frustration was a natural consequence of this misalignment, and where there is frustration, there is a tendency, he said, towards conflict. His remedy was for mankind to devise a general system of thought that would allow it to reorganize its understanding of life towards an acceptance, even an appreciation of process as the fundamental state of all existence. And at the center of this argument was the concept that a human being is an organism within this environment. And if it is to succeed, it has to be adaptable to respond to and develop as this very dynamic environment demands. It's worth just quoting the first paragraph of this book because it sort of encapsulates his argument. It's only a short quote. The book begins, "To be alive is to undergo ceaseless change. Man fears change and seeks to deny it by imposing on it a principle of permanence. That may offer the illusion of escape, but it cannot bring understanding. To understand nature and himself, man must accept change and identify the universal form of process which underlies the variety of particular processes." At the same time as he was absorbing these ideas, Lanyon was increasingly aware that for him, the countryside around St. Ives was now much more than its appearance. He had missed Cornwall during the war. And as is often said, to find home, you must leave it. And that is precisely what happened to Lanyon. He now realized that he knew it like no other place. Not just because he knew its histories, but he did. He knew quite a lot of the histories of this particular area around St. Ives. His family had been a significant part in forming that history in terms of its mining. But more than that, it was because he had grown up there and he carried within his body memories of it, and in his mind, in his senses, he carried his feel for the whole countryside around there. When he was separated from it, he realized that in missing it, how fundamentally that landscape inhabited him. I think we all have this experience of places that we have grown up in very often, or at least places we call home. He was also now much more conscious that to be physically in a landscape was in itself a dynamic activity, that we are normally moving about in the landscape where we're in it. Of course, we can stop and admire the view, but on the whole, we are moving about. And above all, our senses are constantly responding to the changeful environment around us: temperature, light, touch, sound, and so forth. So he began to think of landscape as an experience, not a moment, not a view, something that involved knowledge and memory and perception, and in which one is not a passive viewer, but a center of action yourself. So the question was then, how do you paint that? He realized that the manner that he'd been painting in the 1930s was inadequate, was not well suited to that, because it does suggest a unified space and arguably a moment in time. But it doesn't suggest, or is not well suited to, giving a convincing rendition of his understanding of what a landscape is as an experience. But he was fortunate because he was alive in the middle of the 20th century, and there were other pictorial languages available to him. And he adapted those towards these ends. Peter Lanyon wrote really well. And in 1952, he provided a sort of justification for the manner of painting that he developed in the post-war years. He had come to think by this point, in fact, probably a few years earlier, that the tradition of painting with a foreground, a midground, and a distance was excessively detaching, as if the landscape is seen through a window, as if it is over there, away from you, rather than something that you are in and involved with. In March 1952, he gave a lecture to his students at Corsham, and we have the transcript of it. And this is a short quote from it, but it's worth attending to this because it really is a statement of his philosophy. And you will hear echoes of White's ideas within it. So he starts, this detached and objective vision, and he's talking here about perspectival painting, relies on a basic opposition of man and nature. Man remains apart, nature is arranged, set in blocks of balances. Nature, however, has not remained a panorama or a place to be surveyed from a vantage point. It has not been subjected. The division of man and nature, also all other divisions of dualist thought, not all, let me correct myself there, also other divisions of dualist thought have become inadequate concepts. They are static concepts. A more mobile idea of man's relation to environment was inevitable. Every advance of science and technique, by which he means technology, have been pointing to a necessary change. Biology itself eventually provides the essential knowledge of process and growth. It is clear neither behavior or manners necessary to static concepts, nor the security for a detached vision is now available. The present situation is one of involution. Man is in it. Landscape cannot any longer be governed by static horizons which derived from a fixed viewpoint. The person previously apart from nature now becomes a bearer of a whole journey, a complete experience. Involved in process, his identity is only meaningful in relation to the whole, in this case, a natural process of which he is a part. The painting is a precipitation of this experience. That's the end of the quote. So here we have a philosophical justification for the way that Lanyon decides to paint landscape after the war. For him, it's going to be no less than a true representation of being in the world, of being alive. And at that time, in 1952, he was painting the mining district, which he had painted earlier in that 1938 painting, but now in a completely different way. He painted this picture of a place called Batalac in 1952. Batalac is a hamlet right on the cliff face, not far from Carngalva. And it was once the site of a very famous mine. In fact, it was so famous in the 19th century, it became a tourist attraction. And I think the reason was not that it was a marine mine. Most of these mines in Cornwall were, in the sense that they went under the seabed, but that the mine workings at Batalac actually went down the cliff face, which most of them did not. Lanyon knew the history of this mine very well, and as he did all the mines along this stretch. As I say, his family had been involved in mining. And he knew that when he walked over the land at Batalac, he was walking over an incredibly vast complex of tunnels beneath his feet. He talked of this area as my country and said he carried the mine workings in his body. That's how closely he identified with this area. It was his home. Now, as you can see in this painting, there's absolutely no perspective whatsoever. In fact, there is no single view. There are hints of cross-section, plan, and elevation without any scheme, dominant or clearly stated. We are inside and outside the mine simultaneously. The green and blue we can easily associate with the sky, the sea, grass. The grays may refer to the sea, the whites to light, together maybe to the interior of a mine, a dimly lit interior. The black seems more definitely an interior color, and the rectilinear lines perhaps refer to the shafts and tunnels of a mine or the cables around a mine. What is certain is that I cannot say to you, as I could with the William Nicholson, there's a glider, there's the airfield, this is the space. Because this way of painting prevents us from resolving its elements into a single unified space. It is, by its nature, visually restless. And the painting is not and cannot be governed by one fixed static view. And this is one of the strengths of this manner of painting that Lanyon found and used for his purpose. It is naturally endowed with an ability to create visual ambiguity and suggest something in a constant state of irresolution, or if you prefer, and as he might have preferred, of becoming. But being in the land is different to being in the sky. We can move across the land, and we can, with some difficulty, go down into the earth. But our movement is constrained compared to being in the sky. In the sky, we move up and down, sideways, diagonally, at will. There are no walls and no solid barriers. And you can't stop in the sky. You can't sit down. You can't take a breather. Glider flight is movement from the moment you are pulled down the airfield to the moment at which the glider rolls to its halt at landing. Everything in between is and has to be movement. And throughout a flight, you are inside one of the most dynamic elements in nature, and not passively so. You are constantly adapting and adjusting to that element. Now, Lanyon needed something different to the rather congested style of Batalic for that. And this is a painting called Airscape that he made in 1961. And so he developed this large, free, full-arm, the large, free, full-arm strokes seen in the gliding paintings and seen in this one. All of the gliding paintings are quite large. They're normally about 6 foot high or 6 foot long, and 5 foot or 4 foot in the other dimension. When he exhibited his first group of gliding paintings, several of which I've shown you this evening, the critic, Eric Newton, wrote, "Peter Lanyon's paintings have to be slices cut out of the Empyrean, with areas of wild movement, symbolizing the thrill of the lonely struggle between wings and air, with no definable object, no foreground to give support, no landmark to lean on, no solid form to seize on or find a shape for." Once one has grasped this intention, the pictures become readable. But without the clue contained in the word airborne, they are a little difficult. They are invertebrate. One looks for the scaffolding behind the pageantry of paint, and until one realizes that it is precisely the lack of solid bone that Mr. Lanyon is endeavoring to describe, one is baffled. Well, we are perhaps a little less baffled 65 years later. By now, we're more used to looking at this type of painting, but it still requires us to swap out the normal circuitry of seeing that we use all the time, a circuitry that allows us to resolve forms and color so quickly into a unified space. We have to replace that with a new way of looking, one that attends to and responds viscerally to the immediate facts. And by that, I don't mean just to see the variety of marks and their tempo in a painting such as this, or the clash of mark directions or of colors, or even where they sink into one another, or indeed the sharp and the blurred edges, the gouged through lines and the lightest of strokes, or to notice even the strong horizontal rhythm of this painting, to sense its grandeur, or even to admire the orchestration of all these parts, marvelous though it is. This way of painting requires a manner of looking that asks more of us. It asks for a greater involvement, not just to see the energy, but to feel it. And ultimately, feel the life, not in the painting so much as in and around you. To put you in it, or as Lanyon had said in 1952, man is in it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Toby, for a master.